Today's webinar is on portfolios, and we're going to talk about the scoring guides for portfolios as well. And the webinars are recorded, and they do appear on the CAPE website a day or two after. And I believe we are now posting the PowerPoints as well. So I look forward to today's presentation. 1 o'clock in the afternoon for those of you on the West Coast, still morning. But East Coast folks, it's after lunch. Here's some basics. Many of you already know these things, but they bear repeating for folks that are joining a webinar for the first time. Please mute your phones, because sometimes we get the background noise of dogs or graduate assistants or folks interrupting us during the webinar. And that's totally understandable, but it's also disturbing to others who are listening. So mute your phones and we won't have that problem. However, you need to remember to unmute when you want to talk. And I've often told the story that I have attended webinars and been chattering away asking a question and realized that I was on mute. So another way to ask a question during the presentation is to use the chat room. I believe you have a feature to raise your hand. I've embedded some feedback and question pauses throughout the presentation, and that time I'll check the chats and I'll check to see if anybody's hand is raised. And if I don't, for some reason, capture you, I want you to just speak up. We have a few participants, but not too many, so that if you want to just speak up, I believe that we'll be able to handle that. I have asked CAPE staffers if they're available to come on and join us, and I find it comforting when they're able to, because then they can interject as needed. So just know that CAPE staffers may be online. They may not speak up at all, but sometimes I invite them to make a comment. And the webinar recording and the PowerPoint will be posted on the CAPE website, and I'm saying by June 10th, which gives them about a week to handle this, but usually it's done much sooner than that. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to talk about our goal and our agenda, really. We really want to take a look at the quality of portfolios and talk about submitting them or the data from portfolios in your self-studies as evidence. And my objective is that by the end of this webinar, you will be able to talk about the pros and cons of portfolio from CAPE's perspective, that you'll be able to think about how to respond to the questions about a portfolio when you submit data as evidence and submit your portfolio and your scoring guides with your self-study or as part of the early instrument evaluation. And then last, I hope you'll be able to identify some strengths and weaknesses in sample portfolio scoring guides. I've selected about 6 samples from the internet that were just available as teacher education portfolio scoring guides, and we'll use some of those to talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of each before we finish. So one thing I want to start with is, what are the pros and cons of portfolios? And I think e-portfolios have certainly had a surge of interest in the past, and were very common use of a way to collect and document candidate performance. And they allow us as teacher educators to track individual candidate performance looking across portfolio submissions, and to provide evidence of a range of candidate performance depending on what the purpose of the portfolio is. If it's a best example portfolio, then not. But if it's a range of candidate performance within a particular course so that you can show development over time, then that is possible as well. Most often, portfolios have been used for candidate reflection, a collection of artifacts, and at certain points they reflect on their learning, or they reflect on their preparation embedded in those artifacts, or as a result of those artifacts, as sort of a summative culminating presentation or project. And so we're going to talk a little bit about reflection and using a rubric or scoring guide for candidate reflection. And when these are uploaded into software programs, and I know many of you use the vendored programs that are available, whether those are Chalk and Wire or TK20 or whatever, that they really offer faculty an opportunity to compare candidates both within and across programs, and I think that's a particular strength when you are a large program and are using one of those vendored products. However, from CAPE's perspective, there's some downsides about portfolios, and some of the downsides have to do with poor design. For example, the purpose of the portfolio, is it a file drawer for everything that candidates collect during their preparation programs, their best examples from each course, and they throw it into the electronic portfolio, and then at the end they sort of wrap it all up by talking about, reflecting on all that collection. Sometimes I think we need to think deeply about the purpose of a portfolio and what we want candidates to be able to demonstrate in those portfolios. So we need to think about that end product as much up front as we possibly can. CAPE is also concerned about the comparability, the Interrater Reliability of the scorers. Who are the scorers on your portfolios, and how comparable is, one portfolio to another, or portfolios across time. And that gets us to this part about reliability, okay, and validity, as well as that constant tweaking of contents. Often portfolios can change because they will be a collection of assignments, and they may be key assessments from courses during a candidate's progress, from entry to exit in a preparation program. And as thoughtful professors, we often go about making those oops, I'm seeing something here that says we can't hear anything. Have we started yet? Can you hear me now? Every time I speak, the icon is showing me that my voice is projecting and that I'm being heard. Elizabeth, I see your hand up. I see that you are not yet, you don't have audio yet. So let me reply to Elizabeth. Good. I'm hearing from people. Yes, I can hear you. I had the system call me back. Wonderful. Could someone send a message to Elizabeth Raker that she needs to get on audio? Have them call her back so that she can hear us. Good. Because I want to continue here for those that are online. So I was talking about that comparability, and that as good professors, what we will often do is tweak our assignments, and in the interests of continuous improvement from one semester to another. And at some point, that begins to make the contents of a portfolio less comparable, less strong in terms of comparability over time, and so something to think about, and something for you to discuss within your own faculty. So those are certainly the pros I think we're all familiar with. And these are some of the cons from CAPE's perspective. It has to do with the quality of the assessments, the quality of the evidence that we're putting forward for our evidence for our self-study. And so we're going to get into a few more items about that in a minute. So let me move forward. Here are the places in CAPE where portfolio data is cited by CAPE specifically as evidence that can be submitted as part of the self-study. And it's predominantly in Standard 1. In Standard 1.1, under those in-task categories, and the 4 in-task categories that you're asked to meet, remember, you do not need to meet each of the in-task standards, but you do need to provide evidence about each of these 4 categories. Content. How are the candidates developing their content knowledge, and what evidence is there that their content knowledge has deepened over time? What is their understanding of learners and learning, and how has that understanding and knowledge deepened over time? Their instructional practice, their pedagogical knowledge about instructional practice, and the development of that over time, as well as professional responsibility. And so portfolios can certainly be one of the multiple measures that you could submit to indicate the development of candidate learning, progressive development over time in each of these categories. Another component, I have shorthanded it here and called it research and assessment because it does talk about, this component talks about candidates' use of research and their and frankly their use of assessment and assessment knowledge to develop instructional practice for students and to reflect on their own learning. So it falls into really a number of categories here: learner and learning, instructional practice, and professional responsibility, as well as component 1.2. So remember that when you submit evidence, you're going to be able to tag it multiple times. Okay, so you don't need to keep uploading your evidence again and again. And if you're uploading portfolio evidence on learners and learning and instructional practice, you can then key that also to component 1.2, and you can key it to component 1.4 that your candidates demonstrate their ability to teach all students to college and career-ready standards. So these are the specific areas that CAPE has identified as being standards or components in which portfolio evidence is particularly suited. All right? So let's move on to the next slide. So what we want to talk about, or what I want to talk about now, is about your guiding questions for visiting teams and assessment reviewers. When you're submitting portfolios as evidence in your self-study, these are the categories of questions that you will want to be prepared to answer about your portfolios, okay? So this is coming directly out of the evidence guide on pages 22 to 25, and I've got the evidence guide open here. I want to open it for you to show, where's my evidence guide? There we go. Let me see. I've got it up already, but let me open it for you here. There. This is page 23, where this box about how the assessments are used, how the instruments were constructed, how the instruments are scored. There are a number of questions under each one of these categories that are good guiding questions when you're submitting your self-study for points to include in your responses. So, as my PowerPoint showed you, how was the portfolio used, how was it created, how was it scored, come out of these boxes in the evidence guide. How is the portfolio used? At what point? Where's the emphasis? Are curricular points identified? These are, as I said, questions that you can address when responding to this question as you submit portfolio data and your portfolio and scoring guide as part of your self-study. Next, how are the instruments? How did you create this portfolio? How did you decide what was to be included with it? Are the assessments aligned with the CAPE standard? Okay. Who was involved in the development of the instrument, the portfolio? And then, finally, how was it scored? And this is where you'll upload your scoring guide. And we're going to be spending a good bit of our webinar time looking at a variety of portfolio scoring guides, rubrics, checklists, so that we can talk about sort of the strong and the weak points of each one of those. So to go back to my PowerPoint slide, you'll notice that after each one of these 5 questions that are included in the evidence guide, I've also included a note about AR Category 1, AR Category 2. And in these cases, I'm referring to the assessment rubric, CAPE's assessment rubric. So let me go here, open up the assessment rubric, so that you can see what I'm talking about when I say Category 1. So here's our CAPE assessment rubric. This is available on the CAPE website. And if anybody has a difficulty, I know they launched a new website, and if anybody's having difficulty finding things, look under the resources section or look under accreditation and accreditation resources. You should be able to find the evidence guide, the handbook, and this final rubric. If you have any problem finding these at all, shoot me an email and I'll send it right along to you, straight off my presentation, okay? So here's the final rubric that CAPE will be using to judge instrument purpose, development, and the respondent information. And when I noted here, how is the portfolio used, the way that's going to be judged by CAPE or evaluated by your CAPE reviewers is using the rubric, the assessment rubric, in the first category,
Okay, so let's go back to that assessment rubric again. And there we go. Here's category 1, and you'll notice it says category here, and the number 1, it talks about what's the instrument's purpose and use. So this is the point where you will be using the evidence guide to hone your questions, responses to these questions, and this is the rubric that will guide it. So they're going to say, let's see, if you want to be at a level 3, which is the minimum criteria necessary, okay, to support the fact that you would be meeting a CAPE standard, you want to be right here at level 3, if not level 4. And my personal preference, of course, would be to look at the level 4 rubric. I want to score as highly as I possibly can in these things. And so I would look at this rubric here, which tells you that somewhere in your narrative here about the development, about the purpose and use of your portfolio, you've talked about when it's administered during the program, how their progression is monitored, and how that information is used for mentoring. You've talked about the purpose and its use in candidate monitoring and how you make decisions based on that, and that standards that are used, the CAPE standards and state standards or in-test standards or whatever other standards you use, that those are also explicit in the portfolio. Okay, so let me bring up an example here of a portfolio that does do this right in the portfolio itself. This is a portfolio rubric that is from the University of New Haven in Connecticut. And you can see right off to the left, the very first column, they've talked about the alignment of their standards, the Connecticut standards and the UNH expectations, okay, right there. And they've talked about it explicitly right here, is what is the competency that they're expecting to be demonstrated. They've got their rubric levels here, and then the final column tells what are the portfolio elements that are considered when they apply this particular rubric, okay? So I think that's a good example of showing how that standards alignment can be very explicit right in the portfolio scoring guide or rubric itself. Okay, so to go back to the assessment rubric, we've talked about how it will be used to judge the portfolio purpose and use. And the next item on it is how was the instrument developed? How was that portfolio developed? Who was involved in it? Okay, and as you can see in the minimal level, right here, the very basic level that you would need to meet. Okay, and I'm trying to highlight that, and oops, it's highlighting everything else but, okay, is that it is integrated with the preparation curriculum. And you could see from the example I just showed you from the University of New Hampshire how that was directly integrated, that portfolio was directly integrated with the curriculum, because it talked about the various items on the far left that were included in order to meet those competencies that the University of New Haven had determined were important to their preparation program. But your narrative as you submit portfolio data or your portfolio as evidence would have to include who was engaged in the development of the portfolio or in providing feedback. Let's say that this portfolio, you developed your portfolio years and years ago. There may or may not be records about who was involved, but then who's involved currently in the further development of the portfolio? You know, do you routinely come together and look at this, both all stakeholders, faculty, school-based professionals, whoever, and you would include that in your narrative, at least to be at a minimal level. Because you can see here that if you don't meet the criteria, it's because that portfolio was not developed with wide faculty input and concurrence, okay? And you can see at the highest level that the development of the portfolio involved input at multiple stages, okay? So things to keep in mind as you submit portfolio evidence and respond to the use of portfolios in the self-study. Okay, I'm going to check on our attendees right now and see if we've got everybody online. There's so many people that appear not to yet have audio. I'm hoping that they will find that. Audio connection is critical here. Okay. Let me send a chat to people. There we go. Excuse my typos as I'm trying to do this quite quickly. All right, let's go back to the webinar here. And our slide about guiding questions. So these are the questions that your reviewers, your review team will be using, and these are the categories that the rubric by which they will judge these categories of your responses. Categories 6 and 7 talk about the data itself and how the data on your portfolios are scored and how it's reported, okay? So how it's scored and reported, 6 and 7, 9 and 10, and how our candidates informed goes to the rest. So let me go back one final time to that final rubric to show you what I mean by these categories of questionings. Okay, so information to respondents is really how are the data from the portfolios, how are the candidates provided with feedback, and who else is getting feedback on the portfolio results, okay? Categories 6 and 7 are the rubrics. Here we go, see, scoring levels, and these are scoring guide rubrics. For your portfolio submissions, I assume that there's a rubric or some kind of a tool that is being used to score those rubrics. And these are the rubrics specific to those scoring guides. So we're going to delve into these a little more deeply in just a minute as we look at more examples than the one I just showed you. Okay? And then last of all, we want to go down to how the data are reported. Okay? And let me go a little bit further here. And you've got two rubrics, one for reliability and one for validity, and those are areas 9 and 10. And when you see here on validity, what are the steps that have been taken or will be taken? Notice that a plan for developing the validity can also be submitted as part of your self-study. So if you haven't done this as part of the development of your portfolio, you can explain to Kate that that hasn't been done yet, but here are the steps that you're going to be taken in order to ensure that validity and reliability. Okay? And it is, Category 10 talks specifically about the reliability and how you're establishing your Interrater reliability. Okay, so these are two good parts of this rubric to pay attention to, because you're either going to want to talk about how this has been done or your plans and intentions for getting it done. Good. All right. Now I believe we have a feedback and question break. We do. So I'm going to open myself up to questions here. I'm going to check the chat. I don't see any questions on there, although I did get some feedback for people. If you do send me a chat question, please direct it to me as the host. I know in the past people have written questions into the chat room, but they've been directed to participants, and sometimes I don't get those. I get the ones that are directed to me as the host. So I encourage you to send me chat questions or raise your hand. And right now I only see Elizabeth's hand up. Elizabeth, I hope you're online now as one of the callers. I see call-in user 2, call-in user 3, call-in user 4. I'm hoping that you are one of those. Okay. Any questions? Okay. I'm going to assume there are no questions at this point. You're probably all shell-shocked and wondering what the heck as we talk through this portfolio. So here we go. We're going to go on now to talking specifically about the scoring guide. And I had showed you the assessment rubric in categories 6 and 7 that were the rubrics for scoring guides. And what I've done here is to sort of pull out the key parts of CAPE's expectations about your scoring guides and put them all together in one place. So the first one is the appropriateness of the scoring guide to the tool. Is it aligned with the standards? Has a lot to do with relevance and with appropriateness. So in the example I showed you earlier, right here, you can see where there is clear alignment with the standards. Now, if they were applying for CAPE accreditation, what they would do is simply add what CAPE standard this particular competency is directed at, or they or they could add the in-task category, okay, learner and learning, or instructional planning in this particular case. This is quite a long rubric, and I've only excerpted the part on instructional planning here for illustrative purposes, okay? So they have clear alignment of the standards there. Let's look at another instrument. This is one that I downloaded from the internet. I'm not sure what institution is represented here because it doesn't say. All I know is that this is from Oklahoma, okay? So let me show you what they've got here. They've got a scoring rubric for teacher education portfolio. And you'll notice that it's pretty much of a checklist here. Is it acceptable? Well, it's present and includes its name. Does it need improvement? All right. Now, one of the strengths of this particular example is that it's very comprehensive. Okay, it's going through not only every aspect or all these pieces in there. Okay, but it's also going into it in its progressive. For example, this whole first section that is included in the rubric has to do with their teacher education program, okay? So once they're finished with the teacher education program entirely, then these are the pieces that are being judged by the advisor. Upon completion of student teaching, there are these additional pieces of the portfolio that need to be included. Okay, so they're trying to get in just about everything that they can with a very simple, is it there, is it not there? Okay, and lack of a particular piece is going to result in being discounted. Now here's where it gets interesting, because there are a list of competencies here, but they're more like competency categories than they are really defining what the competency is. For example, when it says core curriculum, I'm not quite sure what that means. Is it content knowledge that they're talking about, or knowledge of the, core curriculum standards, or what that is? R refers to reflection, A refers to artifact, and they're supposed to include 2 artifacts and reflections on those artifacts in each one, and they're to be given a score. And there are 10 categories down here for them to have included something. Whoops, I lied. There are 15 categories for them to have included. But this is where I think there's a possible need for some improvement, is to include what those standards are. We also don't really have a rubric here that tells us how to judge these things. So if we look now, here's what their scoring rubric is. There's a score for their reflection, and there's 2 points possible, and there's a score for artifacts, and there are 2 points possible. And yet, even though it says there are 2 points possible, the rubric includes 4 points at the target level. So if I were a reviewer, a CAPE reviewer, I would really begin to wonder, oh boy, so I don't know what the point values mean. 2 is possible, but there's 4 apparently possible here. And as you can see, the rubric includes a bit of a checklisty approach again. Are there 5 portions included? So I can be acceptable at a competency if I have 5 points included and have shown you a weak reflection and a weak relation to something called the lighthouse metaphor. I suspect that might be the conceptual framework. And so this is another area where if I were a CAPE reviewer, I might call this into question and say, wow, you know, two weaknesses and 5 pieces included are acceptable. And so think about, as you're developing your scoring rubrics, is that really an acceptable level of performance for you on this? It doesn't talk anything about the depth of the reflection. It just says a weak relationship. And so one of CAPE's criteria for evaluation has to do with, is there an agreed upon meaning? Are the things definable and agreed upon? Okay, so if we go back to that example A, I wonder if everybody would be in agreement about what a weak relation of artifact to competency would be in terms of the reflection versus a clear defense. Okay, what does that mean? And so here's the part where that reliability comes in, and how have you trained your reviewers to have some agreement about what those terms mean, all right? One of the other criteria for CAPE is it observable? Explicit in defining expectations at distinct levels of performance. And I can't say that there's much here that would be observable. If we go back to the competencies, we see them almost as a checklist. Is there an artifact related to this? Is there a second artifact? And then it's graded, but I don't really know what the performance of lifelong learning, what is the behavior, observable thing that I would be looking for as demonstrated in the portfolio to show me that this candidate was at an acceptable level in terms of lifelong learning. So there we go. Let's go back to this again. Is each level distinct from one another? Does it give you specific and meaningful feedback? So if we look at level example A, and we look at their scoring guide, it's predominantly focused on the reflections or the inclusion of a particular artifact, but not about performance here, where we could say that distinct levels of performance that could provide the candidate with significant feedback could need some improvement in this particular portfolio rubric. So let's go back to our example, our second example from the University of New Haven, where we see what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, and what is target. And you can see here, I think, that as a faculty member assessing this candidate's student teaching competency of their ability to design a logical and coherent unit of instruction, I'm going to look across their portfolio lessons at their lesson plans, at their student learning objectives, at their lesson reflections, at student work, and at assessments to make a determination if that student-teacher competency is at the unacceptable, acceptable, or target level. And as we read across, we can see, is there a way for me as a reviewer of this portfolio and a mentor to this teacher candidate to give some specific feedback that would allow that candidate to improve, to know exactly what they needed to do to move to the next level. So if we look at the sequence, just look at this first bullet point here, that the sequence of the lesson in the mini-unit is illogical, it's incomplete, or it's disconnected. So that would tell me that I could point out to the student where I saw some things that didn't make sense being put together. They were illogical. Or, wait a minute, you got this part, but you didn't finish it. It was incomplete. Or, it was disconnected. Why was this up front and this 2 or 3 points later in your lesson, okay? So here, at the next level, I say it's somewhat logical, but connections to the overarching unit concept are unclear or not explicit. So here I could say, you know, you did pretty good on laying this out, but there was no connection back to what the concept was that you were trying to teach. You sort of introduce those things as discrete and separate, distinct elements, not looping the students back to the whole. And then target level, I could say, you know, your unit components were logical, they were really coherent, the unit was clearly focused on conceptual understanding of that concept. I love the way you kept tying it back to what the overarching concept was. So this particular rubric here does provide us with opportunities to provide very explicit feedback to the candidates, and that was one of those elements by which a scoring guide will be judged by the reviewers. Can it provide specific and meaningful feedback? And then last, do all the criteria together describe the whole of the learning outcome? And so we'll go back to our example B here from the University of New Haven, and see that all of these are related to instructional planning. This is all their three. As I said, it was a lengthy rubric, and I did simply excerpt this page so that to focus our attention. And we can see that designing a unit, presenting that content accurately, and then leading students to learn, sort of all together, this really does kind of get at an effective teaching sequence. I'm sure we know that there are things before that, and there are conceivably things after 3.5 that would even tie it together more closely. But there's not something just left all alone and hanging. And that's another challenge I would see in this earlier rubric scoring guide example that I gave you, where it talks about instructional planning here, but it's a single bullet, and I have absolutely no idea what are the elements of that or what the faculty might consider to be important components of that, in contrast to the University of New Haven rubric, which I feel is much more comprehensive in that regard. Okay, so these are the things CAPE's going to be looking for in your scoring guide related to a portfolio. Is it aligned with the standards? Are there any places where the meaning might not be agreed upon? And if it is agreed upon, is it definable or defined somewhere? Is it observable? Are the levels distinct from each other, and can they provide significant feedback? Does everything come together to describe the whole of the learning outcome? And then finally, they're going to be looking at this freedom from bias. And they're predominantly talking about those assessment rubric categories 9 and 10 that have to do with validity and reliability. Okay, and so you're going to want to think about how you have trained your scorers to obtain that reliability. And we'll talk about that in one more minute. Let me pause again to see if we have any questions now. I'm going to click on my attendee thing here and see if anybody has their hand up. Elizabeth, I do see your hand is up. Do you have a question for us? And I don't see any questions in the chat either. So I'm going to assume that nobody's written me a question to host or presenter, or host and presenter. I'm going to assume that nobody has a question because no hands are raised. So let me just pause briefly and see if there are any questions. Okay, what I'm going to do now is share a couple of more examples for you. We're right about 20 minutes left in our presentation on portfolio, so I want to share some other examples because there are a whole bunch of ways that people have approached evaluating portfolios with rubrics. And I think there are strengths and opportunities for improvement in just about every one of them as I look through them. Remember, I just grabbed these off the internet and freely available. So let me go into example C here. What we have here is a leadership portfolio, okay? And it's talking about overall, all right? And I think it's important. I think we all know that it's important that these portfolios be complete, okay? That they have in them what you expect to have in them. and that sort of holding our candidates accountable for having those pieces is not something we can ignore. Okay, so don't think that CAPE is saying you shouldn't have these pieces. What they are saying is that in addition to these pieces, okay, that are checklists to make sure that everything's in there that should be in there, there's another way to provide candidates with significant feedback, and that there are levels of performance that are distinct and identified, and that it's aligned with standards. Now right here you can see this is from Wisconsin, and these are administrative standards, but it illustrates the point of having the standards identified up front, and they are, and the students are being held accountable, okay, that each one of these standards has been addressed in their portfolio right off the bat. Now where it got a little puzzling for me as a reviewer, and I look at these as a CAPE reviewer. Okay, great, I see the standards up front, but here's where it gets a little confusing, okay? Professional vision statement, okay? Does it meet the criteria? Well, to meet the criteria, it's a clearly focused statement, and it provides a clear sense of the individual as an educator or leader. So where this particular portfolio evaluation rubric is what it was called, it doesn't tell me as a student if I fall below or above that, what would that look like? There isn't a sort of distinct levels of performance. It has chosen, this particular portfolio evaluation tool has chosen to focus on the meeting the criteria. And as such, CAPE would definitely provide feedback in terms of it's not providing the range of distinct levels of performance that might be apparent across many portfolios, okay? The other thing that sort of puzzles me are these categories that appear here. You see professional vision statement, and you see focus on learning, okay, which has got a great question about, you know, in your position as a school leader, how would you assess and improve equity in student learning, including students who traditionally struggle and students with disabilities? Terrific thing to have as a competency. We want to know that our school leaders are able to do that. And yet I don't, as a reviewer, I say, now wait a minute, where did this relate to the standards? Where's the alignment here, okay? I'm left to sort of puzzle that out and figure out, well, would that fall under standard 3, advocating, nurturing, and sustaining a culture and instructional program conducive to student learning? Or would it be under integrity, fairness, and ethics? So one of the things to think about in development of portfolio scoring guides, too, is the explicitness of that alignment, so that we know that the Wisconsin standards aren't separate and distinct, really, from these elements that are being focused on and meeting the criteria, okay? So it goes through there, and you're checking off, the reviewer is checking off whether each of these things are meeting the criteria, and building nested communities and acquiring and aligning resources. And each one of these things are very important areas for leaders to have, but you want to be as explicit as you can be in aligning those together. So here is the final page of this rubric, which says that successfully meeting all of those above criteria warrants a pass. And here's what happens after that. It says if there are some revisions on no more than 3 domains, you have a week-long revision period, and it says that specific feedback will be provided to guide revisions. And that's important to CAPE, that there be specific feedback, remember? But I don't see where how that happens. So as a reviewer, I would be saying, so how do you provide that feedback? Since meets the criteria is the only one there, then the feedback that is given to each candidate conceivably could be dependent upon the person who's doing the review. And whereas one person might give them feedback in one area of regard, another might not, and might emphasize an area of expertise that is their particular comfort area. So this raises a lot of questions about the fairness, the reliability, and to some extent the validity of the scoring guide and the portfolio itself. So I bring that to your attention and raise these points only as things to consider if you're using ePortfolio and expect to use portfolio data and your portfolio and scoring guides submitted as evidence for your self-study. These are some things to think about. Okay, so here's we have from Kennesaw State University a portfolio narrative evaluation guide, and you can see right here where every one of those components is just really clearly outlined here. You know, whether the candidate demonstrates current knowledge of their discipline content, and then they get a summary rating in a particular area. And these areas are the subject matter experts, the facilitators of learning, the collaborative professionals. And I would assume that these three areas of subject matter expertise, facilitators of learning, and collaborative professionals are coming from their conceptual framework. These are the emphases that Kennesaw State University gives to their preparation programs, is that they want everybody to develop these three areas of expertise. I would suggest that showing somewhere along in this rubric how this is also aligned with in-task categories or CAPE standards or whatever would definitely strengthen the submission of this so that there aren't questions raised, okay, at a very basic level. But we see that they're going to be scored at level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 4. So I say to myself, okay, so what are those levels? And are all of them similar? And here's what we say. They're very clear, and I think this is good, that this instrument is used across time throughout their programs, and that they expect that lower ratings would occur in the beginning of a candidate's evaluation, and that later on in student teaching they might get higher ratings, okay? And they're explicit in saying they think it would be pretty rare for a candidate to get a high 4 rating prior to student teaching, right? So here we go. But given that this is progressive, which I think is a real plus for the portfolio, my question as a reviewer would be, well, okay, so where in it do I know that this was early in the career and not during student teaching or whatever? It tells the semester here and the course that it was done in, but then the reviewer would be left to sort of figure out how this ties to later evaluations and might have questions about how the data is presented. So you'd have to be very clear when you're presenting the data from the portfolios at what point in the progression from entry to exit that collection of data. What does it represent? Who does it represent? And at what point in their programs? So the scoring rubric here applies to every single category, okay? And what's interesting is that it talks about there being evidence, and it speaks about the evidence in a way that is very accreditation sensitive, because in the past, with many of the NCATE rubrics, there was this kind of language in it about little or no evidence, there was limited evidence, there was clear evidence, or there was clear, consistent, and convincing evidence. And so it gets at preponderance of evidence here in terms of the portfolio, okay? But the rest, well, and, not but and, the rest of the rubric talks about their writing, okay? So it talks about their writing's rich in description, it addresses all the proficiencies, they make clear, convincing connections, they consistently emphasize the impact on student learning, there are positive opinions and interactions with students. And so then again, as the reviewer, I go back to the title of this, which says, right off the bat, this is a narrative evaluation guide. So they're talking about really the student reflections or the student narrative that accompanies the artifacts that are put forth. So then my question becomes, okay, so are there other aspects of the portfolio that are also evaluated, because there's the narrative about whether they, so what's being judged here is the narrative about whether they demonstrate broad knowledge of their discipline content. So it's not, is it or is it not judging candidate performance here, or is it judging the narrative about candidate performance? So anyways, as a reviewer, I would have some questions that I would want to address. And so if you were uploading this artifact, this portfolio, and its scoring guide and data into your self-study, you might very well get some questions back from your reviewers that if in the questions you addressed earlier, when you talk about its purpose and its use, and you talk about how it was developed, and you talk about how data and feedback is given to your candidates, if those haven't provided the reviewer with the kind of clarity that they would need in order to answer these questions for themselves, you might well get questions back that you think, wow, you know, how come they're asking this question? I thought it was pretty clear. But just let me say that that happens routinely, where the kinds of presentations that we make about our evidence and the evidence itself leave certain gaps to a third party looking at this as an external reviewer. Okay, so these might be some questions that would come up, and all you have to do in your addendum or in your response to that feedback phase is to fill in the gaps, okay, and tell them, oh, well, here's how we use this, and here's how candidate performance, and here's the relationship between our evaluation of the narrative and candidate performance. So this is one piece of the puzzle. Okay, and one way by which we can assess the candidate's understanding of the importance of these elements and these competencies. Okay, so we're now at 1:52 p.m. I want to stop with my examples. I've got a few more, but I think the rest might not give us any more useful information than these examples already have. So let me go back to the webinar and move on to the next slide, which deals with Interrater reliability questions. And this is not a CAPE document that I'm sharing with you here. These are not CAPE's perspectives on Interrater reliability. It's something I found on the internet from Educational Testing Service about Interrater reliability, and I thought, wow, these are really appropriate questions to ponder, to think about, and to think about including when we answer that category 9 or 10, I think it's category 9, no, category 10 that deals with reliability of our scoring guides. These might be some good hints about information to include in either this is what we've done or this is what we plan to do to ensure the reliability of our scoring of student portfolios. So first, are they trained to recognize when they have a bias? And this is really, really important because it's so true that we have a variety of people who look at these portfolios, and all of us have our own areas of expertise in terms of our own scholarship and our professionalism, as well as our own sort of personal quirks and understandings about things. And what we need to do as reviewers is to understand the ways in which those things can become a bias to our ability to be fair in our scoring of portfolio submissions by a student, or their reflections, or their narratives. All right? Do you think about including your scores in a rigorous training program? And so it was interesting to me that it talked about a training program that includes a demonstration of understanding of the standards, okay, the criteria for those, the entry directions, the scoring guide, and everything. So there's sort of this thing to me that there were two parts of a training program for reliability, and one is whether all the scorers are on the same page when it comes to the standards and the criteria and the scoring guide and all the sort of components, let's say, of a portfolio. And then next is really their mastery of the scoring, Okay, so first is there a training about those overview and introductory and sort of general items that everybody should understand, and then have they been trained to score candidate performance across a number of times, okay? And that's here, multiple practice sessions. And I think that what I've been involved in as a faculty member or even as an administrator at a university or college is sort of a, we do our Interrater Reliability training as a one-shot deal. Everybody comes together, you score a particular student narrative or a comprehensive exam or whatever, you come to some agreement about your scores, and then, we're done for the year. We got our sort of inoculation of reliability during that setting. And what this is raising is the issue that there should be multiple practice sessions, not just one-shot deals. And so do it, and then perhaps supplement that with an opportunity for all the scorers to come together online, let's say, and score a particular portfolio. You can use SurveyMonkey for that purpose and see to what degree there's alignment or not, coherence across responses and scores. And so that's the final thing. Have they been trained to score with some close agreement? We understand that there are professional subjective opinions involved in any kind of score, but it should not be so wildly different that some faculty member would score student responses as outstanding and at the target level, whereas someone else would score it as unacceptable. The difference between acceptable and target, might be close enough depending on your rubric and the explicitness of your rubric and the degree to which your scorers have been trained in that. And so I felt these were some pretty good questions to come up and consider as you're responding to that question about reliability, and as you're thinking about perhaps developing a plan for reliability in the future that you would submit as part of your self-study. Okay, so next we've got, I think, a final feedback and question pause here. And I do see some questions on my chat, and I am so happy to see that. Okay, so let me read off this question and hope to answer it. I noticed there is one evaluator here. This would assume that multiple evaluators went through a scoring training prior to the assignment of this portfolio. So individual portfolios do not have to be scored by more than one scorer. Wow, no, I would say, you should have more than one scorer on a portfolio. And although that was one scorer, I don't know, and it's a good point to have brought up. We don't know if there are multiple scorers. If this is perhaps the form that is used by each one of the scorers, and then those scores are aggregated. I mean, these are the kinds of questions, absolutely, that would come up by a CAPE reviewer, because we would look for freedom, freedom from bias, that there would be more than one scorer of a portfolio or a comprehensive exam. If something has that much weight, is a culminating project portfolio for an entire program, and that it's a key assessment, and that non-performance on this or a bad score on this would prevent a candidate from being recommended for licensure, then I would hope that there would be more than one scorer involved in that, because it's pretty high stakes for the candidates. Okay, so let me go over here and view all the attendees and see if there are any hands up. And right now, according to my little picture, which you probably see is a grayed out space in the middle of your screen, no hands are up with questions. So I'm going to pause and allow anybody to speak up or type in a question. And the last person typed it to me, the host, as a private question, and I appreciate that because I got it. So if you've typed a question into all participants or all attendees, that means I probably didn't get your question. So resubmit. Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so let me move on. I am going to hang out afterwards and let you know they'll hang out afterwards and answer individual questions. I'm going to mail you a feedback survey. You'll get it by June 10th. Chances are you'll get it within the next 2 days, but definitely by June 10th. That'll ask you for feedback on this particular webinar and ask you for suggestions for improvement in the future. These are the next 3 webinars I'll be presenting, the dates and times. June 16th, we're going to have a webinar on drafting plans as part of the self-study. I mentioned today that you could include a plan for developing validity and reliability on your instruments. That's not the only place where CAPE is accepting plans in lieu of evidence, okay, or in lieu of absolute interreliability ratings. So if you're interested in that whole drafting plans part, please join me on June 16th at 5. Then on July 7th, after the 4th of July weekend, we're going to be talk about planning your evidence submissions. I'm going to be sharing a tool that was developed at one of our accredited institutions where they sort of map out what evidence they have for each of the components, CAPE components, and I think it's a very handy tool to use, and we'll talk about how to sort of plan those evidence submissions. And then on July 16th, we're going to talk about those self-study evidence questions. Today we talked about them a little bit in terms of your scoring guides, what kinds of evidence questions you can expect to respond to, and by July 16th, I hope to be able to share more with you. And then finally, I hope this webinar didn't lead you to cross off nothing to do on your to-do list. If it was successful, then I hope there are a few things for you to think about or to consider doing with your faculty as you look at your portfolios or look at the portfolio scoring guides. So I do see a hand up now, and so I'll be quiet. Anthony, you have a question, so please ask. Remember to unmute yourself. Hello? Question? Anthony? All right, so unless somebody speaks up, the webinar is done for today. I thank you for attending, and as I said, I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes afterwards so that if someone has a question, they can just speak up and ask. And I see some people have already left us. That's fine. If you want to hang out and ask me a question, please do. I see a couple of people speaking up. Please remember to unmute yourself because I see you're muted and yet you're also talking. So unmute yourself so I can hear you. Anybody? Got quite a few people left online here. Okay, still not hearing any questions. So what I'm going to do is stop the recording. There we go.